Our speaker this morning is Ken Leonard. Ken is a great friend of Sunset International Bible Institute. He's one that is seen here every year at our workshop, our Sunset Vision workshop. He has his display here every year, and he's been a friend of this school for a long time. In fact, if you go into our heritage room, you'll find a kind of an ancient chalice, a silver chalice that was given to Alexander Campbell years ago, and Ken found that chalice and donated it to us, and it's in the heritage room. If you want to go in there and look at that sometime, it's a piece out of history. But Ken is not just a friend of this school. He's a friend of any city, any church, any place in this whole region of states that has some kind of natural disaster. Because he's one of the directors with Churches of Christ disaster relief effort. They've been involved in these disasters that we've heard about lately. In Houston, South Texas, in Florida, and other places. And anytime there's a disaster, one of their big 18-wheelers will be rolling down the highway, headed for that disaster with all kinds of relief supplies. So I hope that you will keep this Church of Christ disaster relief effort in mind when you see a disaster or hear about a disaster. There are some brochures up on the communion table. If you'd like to stop and pick one of those up, it would be helpful for you to know about a resource that you will have now and in the future as disaster strikes where you might be living. So help us to welcome Ken in the style that we've become accustomed to. Come.
Y'all, I love Sunset. And before I get started, I want to tell y'all, there's two brochures up here. One is ours, the blue one, but the orange-colored brochure is Churches of Christ Disaster Response Team. We send stuff to a disaster, and you're going to be astounded. And where did I just put? There it is. You're going to be astounded at how many churches when we get to that. The most I've ever worked at one time at one disaster was 5. You'll be floored by what you're going to see. But Church of Christ Disaster Response Team coordinates volunteers. And right now their two primary locations is Portland, Texas, working the Rockport area. Rockport is where the hurricane made landfall. And there's not a building in Rockport that wasn't badly damaged, including the Church of Christ in Rockport. The entire back wall was blown out like a balloon. But they're also coordinating volunteers in the Beaumont area. Something like 70% of the town of Beaumont was flooded. The entire town of Port Arthur was flooded. Every single home in the town of Port Arthur. Lumberton, almost every town was flooded. There's so many. I just saw an estimate last night that there are 100,000 homes in Texas that were flooded or destroyed by wind in the hurricane. That's a staggering number. Our threshold is about 50 homes, and we'll respond with a truckload of relief. But if y'all want to volunteer, the relief effort is going to take a long time. I also want to mention an organization called Serving God by Serving Others that's out of the Preston Crest Church of Christ in the Dallas area. They're working in Houston, and also working in the Houston area with the Bamel Church of Christ is the Memorial Road Disaster Relief Group out of Edmond, Oklahoma. Contact any of those if y'all are interested. And the relief, they're going to be working for at least a year. So when you're off on summer vacation, contact one of those groups if you want to go down and work. And we have a saying that lighthouses don't compete, and that's why I don't mind promoting the other organizations in the Brotherhood that do this. It is tremendous to be part of them. And if you work with them, you'll sleep on the floor of a classroom in a church building somewhere on an air mattress. I call it a redneck sleep number bed. It's it's actually pretty comfortable, and you'll like it. I'm going to tell you all a secret, and it won't be obvious unless I tell you that. Some people imagine they can hit home runs like Aaron Justice, and some people imagine they can throw touchdowns like Dak Prescott. I imagine that I can preach somewhere between Jim McGuigan and Marshall Keeble. When you hear me preach, that won't be obvious, but in my head, that's what I preach like. How many can relate to that? Yep. Only young, I'm talking about younger Jim McGuigan when he didn't wander off in the weeds so often. I just heard him at the Harding lectureship, and I love listening to him. But y'all, this disaster response has been absolutely incredible. I have always felt like we were able to respond to a large-scale disaster. And to give you some perspective, probably the biggest disaster response in the Christian world was the Ethiopian famine. I think this response is bigger. There were a lot of people that died, but we didn't have to rebuild houses during the Ethiopian famine. We're sending truckloads of food and things like that. And I believe this is the largest disaster in the Christian world since Antioch. If you lined up all of the streets that have everyone's belongings piled up at the street, that street would be over 1,000 miles long. I mean, it's a staggering number. But don't forget, God is on His throne. That God is going to use this disaster for His glory. And I can't help but remember, I used to teach history and think about the Chicago fire. That was, at that time, that was the biggest disaster in our nation's history. But you know what the Chicago fire drew? It drew relief efforts from all over the country. People raised money to help Chicago. It drew the nation together, and they put together the greatest collection of architects, engineers, investors, and craftsmen that the world had ever seen to rebuild Chicago. And you wouldn't know who Sullivan or Frank Lloyd Wright or any of those guys were if it were not for the Chicago fire. That's what's going to happen in Texas and in Florida. It's going to rebuild better than ever. Can you imagine what Port Arthur is going to be like once it's rebuilt? It's going to be awesome. But that's what's going to happen, and that's just a little political perspective. As we read in Acts the 11th chapter, and I love that I got to have it read because I like telling it as a story, because that's the way Luke wrote it. Was as a story. That Cornelius had been baptized already, so there were already Gentiles who were Christians. But after Stephen was killed, they sent out missionaries because it wasn't safe to stay in Jerusalem. So they sent missionaries out with specific instructions: only preach to the Jews. Don't preach to the Gentiles. We've got enough problems already. Well, so the missionaries went out and they did what they were told, and they went to other cities and they preached the gospel and converted other people who didn't get the memo. And so they went to Antioch and they converted Gentiles in Antioch. Thank the Lord. Because all of us who aren't of Jewish heritage that are here because of the gospel being taken to the Gentiles in the first century. And when Jerusalem heard that Gentiles had been baptized in Antioch, They said, we've got to check this out. So they sent a delegation. And who did they send? One of the most respected members of the church in Jerusalem, Barnabas. They sent Barnabas. Barnabas said, this is okay. And here's the Jim McGuigan part. Do you know what Barnabas saw when he got to Antioch? He looked in the eyes of those Gentile Christians and he saw the same thing he saw in the eyes of Saul. When he spoke on his behalf in Jerusalem, he saw the future. That's what Barnabas saw in the eyes of those Gentile Christians, and that's what he saw in the eyes of Saul. So he said, I've got to put these two together. And he went to Tarsus and got Saul and brought him back to Antioch. And Saul served his apprenticeship not with the leaders in Jerusalem for that year, but with those brand new Gentile Christians and Barnabas and a few others from Jerusalem. That's who Paul served his apprenticeship. That's why he was such an effective minister in the New Testament church. And I tell people all the time, don't worry if you don't know anything about disaster relief if disaster hits your town. Disaster relief was invented by rank amateurs because when Agabus got there, he stood up and he said, there's going to be a famine. Well, those brand new Gentile Christians, and what time do I need to finish up? Okay, I will hurry. Agabus stood up and said, there's about to be a disaster back in Judea. And so those Gentile Christians said, we need to start taking up a collection. And they did it a full year before the disaster actually happened. That's who we've learned from. If you did an organizational chart about disaster relief in the first century and disaster relief now, the organizational chart is almost exactly the same. Only we're that caravan taking gifts from churches to lay them at the feet of the elders where they're needed. Let me show you the video. I wish I had time to. Afterwards, if you want to hear the story about JW, I'll be glad to tell it. Every truck that I'm going to show you a list of churches, and every church represents about $95,000 for the first truckload. And every truckload, some of the congregations we've sent 2, and some we're sending 3 to already. I wasn't hitting the wrong button. 85% of everything we bring in goes directly to disaster victims. It takes us 15% to operate the organization. And then we follow up with beds, furniture, appliances for low-income households with no insurance. I don't know if y'all thought about this. First we had Harvey. Then we had Irma. And then we had Maria. What does that spell? Isn't that interesting? Be still and know that I'm God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. Psalms 26, 10, and 11. Here's the list of churches, and generally it follows the path of the hurricane. I started out at Rockport, or in the Rockport area. And boy, and I can't read that. I'm going to have to turn around. Portland, Texas was the first place we set up, was because the emergency management officials at Rockport said, we're not going to even let anybody in until we get power restored, which is going to be a matter of months and maybe even a year. Well, then 4 feet of rain fell on Houston, and all the military had to go to Houston, so that plan kind of fell apart. So we eventually got to go to Rockport, but I set up at Portland, Texas, and that's where at North Bay Church of Christ is where Church of Christ Disaster Response Team is set up. And then we set up at Rockport. And then Woodsboro, which is right behind Rockport. You've probably not heard of Woodsboro, but it's a small town that was damaged almost as bad as Rockport. LaGrange Church of Christ. 300 homes were flooded in the town of LaGrange, which by itself is an enormous disaster. But on the scale, this was just a tiny little corner. But we wanted to make sure that South Texas was not forgotten, so we sent trucks there first before we started into the bigger cities. The Central Church of Christ in Victoria, 19 members of the church gathered at the church building. The hurricane was on top of them for 6 hours while 20 people huddled. Nobody's been through 6 hours of a hurricane before, unless you're on a ship and do it on purpose. This was a slow-moving hurricane. El Campo Church of Christ. The Abel Street and the Martin Luther King congregation, because they were so long getting stuff in, they were flooded and couldn't get stuff in. Texas flooded them with stuff, so we didn't have to send one of our trucks, but we're still going to send beds and furniture and appliances there. Port Lavaca on the coast. Lakewood Church of Christ in Baytown, and I know there's not a number in Baytown. I did this in a hurry yesterday, so I apologize. Brookshire Church of Christ outside of Houston. The Central Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. The Cinco Ranch Church of Christ in Katy, Texas. The church building flooded at Cinco Ranch. The Deer Park Church of Christ, we've sent a truck. The Jersey Village Church of Christ. We were 2 weeks getting trucks. Normally we keep six truckloads on shelves ready to put on an hour's notice. Our big problem has been getting drivers and trucks to get stuff down there. Well, Jersey Village had a member, one of their elders is one of the managers of a trucking company, and they sent a truck up and got theirs. So it was kind of cool. This will knock your socks off, and that's a wrong figure. That was a year-to-date figure. They have baptized 8 people so far. They baptized 55 year-to-date, but it's only 8 as a direct result, which is still a huge number of people, as a direct result of the relief effort. And I apologize. Don't put down 55. That's a year-to-date figure. And the same, I got a wrong figure yesterday from Highland Heights. 24 is a year-to-date figure. They have baptized 15 so far as a direct result of the relief effort. But 300 is also a wrong number. They've set up over 400 Bible studies at Highland Heights Church of Christ in downtown Houston. And I apologize for having wrong figures on the slide. We've sent a truck to South Union Church of Christ. We sent one to Westbury Church of Christ in Houston. We've sent one to Bamel Church of Christ, where Memorial Road is working, rebuilding houses, cleaning out houses. We've sent one to Darien Loop Church of Christ, to Fidelity Church of Christ, to the Aldine Mail Route Church of Christ, to the Porter Church of Christ in Conroe, to the Woodland Oaks Church of Christ. And the next one is kind of cool. To the North Woodlands area Church of Christ. Who knows something about that congregation? James and Tiffany, what's their last name? What is it? Lindemann. Yes, Lindemann. Yes, they begged me to send a truck. And I said, well, Woodland Oaks had already asked for a truck. And so they were both trying to get me to send a truck. I said, fine, we'll send a truck to both. And I had supper with James and Tiffany. They are on fire for the Lord. I mean, they were chomping at the bit to start to work with this disaster relief effort. And they are my poster people for Sunset. And I knew him from when I'd come set up, and he was excited about the work then. Now he's neck deep in it. we've sent two trucks to Sulphur, Louisiana, because at first that's the only way we could get anything to Port Arthur and Beaumont and those areas. And the Louisiana Special Forces and the Louisiana Navy were taking stuff by boat from Louisiana to get it to people. Texans, I hate to tell you, won't leave their home even if it's got water in it. Westgate Church of Christ is awesome. And is that the correct time? I've only got a couple minutes. Okay. The Nederland Church of Christ. The Lumberton Church of Christ, we're only doing beds, furniture, and appliances. The Thomas Boulevard Church of Christ in Port Arthur. The Lakeside Park Church of Christ in Port Arthur. Ninth and Elm in Orange. The Naples, and then Hurricane Irma hit. So we have sent, we're actually sending a second truckload to Naples. Lehigh Acres Church of Christ in Fort Myers. Immokalee, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. We've sent a truck there. We're sending a truck to Jacksonville. And right now, today, we should have a truck unloaded in Marathon in the Florida Keys because we hadn't been able to get access to them. And we have an agreement with Healing Hands International, which is our sister organization. They're just down the street from us in Nashville. They're going to be taking containers to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands because they're still Americans, and we're going to be taking care of them. Quickly, why did I ask to come to Sunset? Because I owe a debt. And right now, there is a wave. In 2 Corinthians, when Paul talks about the response of Macedonia to the relief effort, he talked about the grace that God was giving to the Macedonians. He's not talking about the people in Judea where the disaster actually happened. And there is a flood of God's grace taking place in this nation that makes that 4 foot of rain that fell on Houston look like a spring shower. And I just had to come and share that with you. Thank you, and y'all go preach the word.